Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We're doing all types of NBA coverage right now. Gonna now be moving on to the Minnesota Timberwolves officially sweeping the Phoenix Suns and talking about this entire situation. Now, I do want to start a little bit more on the positive side here. We're gonna get into the Suns. I'm sure we're gonna be touching more on it as the offseason comes as well. But I want to start with the Timberwolves here, who have just been so promising, and I know that a lot of people sort of were off the scent because of the matchup against the Suns, the way that the Suns won the regular season series. This is another example, and I have been saying this a little bit repetitively over the course of the show that I've been here at GSMC, but regular season matchups in the NBA do not mean anything. The playoffs are such a different animal, especially in a league like the NBA, where the level of intensity, as much as, I enjoy watching the 82 games in a regular season, it is probably a little bit too much, but also just the fact that players don't really care quite as much, and this is a definitely another example of that. And this is, again, I want to start with the positives for Minnesota before I get into Phoenix too much here. But the Timberwolves pull away 122-116 in this game. It just seemed like, despite the fact that the Suns were the ones who had their backs up against the wall, they had a pretty solid Phoenix crowd in support of them in this game. It was just the Timberwolves who were really even still playing with a little bit more of the energy that they needed. I wouldn't quite call it desperation, because the Suns are the ones who actually were desperate, and you can't really manufacture that level of urgency. But the Timberwolves, I think I said this about them before, where it almost feels like they're almost a little too inexperienced and ignorant to understand the level of desperation, that comes in the playoffs, where especially there was a story that came out, I believe it was during Game 3, which was on Friday, where the reporters were talking about the fact that Mike Conley had spoken to the team about how, this is one of his last years, and he just went on about how nothing's a given in the NBA. Sure, you guys might make the conference finals or so again in the future, but you just never know. He also said that this is likely one of his final years of actually being on a championship competitive team. Conley was, of course, a massive part of those Grizzlies teams that made it at least one Western Conference Finals during the early 2010s. So it just seems like this team is still so locked in, and Anthony Edwards is just an absolute killer. He has been so much fun to watch. He was tremendous again last night. 40 points. It seemed like every time they needed a big shot, it was him coming through. And specifically the range. And that's the thing is, Edwards was sort of, at least in this series in particular, a little bit seen as the X factor because of the fact that he only averaged 14 points per game during the regular season in his matchups against Phoenix. And, we're going to be getting into Bradley Beal from a Suns perspective. I did think that the way that they were trying to sort of dig down on Anthony Edwards, how they were playing up on him, I thought that Beal was working incredibly hard trying to get over the screens in his first handful of games, trying to prevent switches as much as possible, but they just could not hold him down for too long. He ends up exploding in this game for his 40, and again, big shot after big shot, and he was extending it with the range too. He was just incredible in this one. This was a great Karl-Anthony Towns game as well, who looks like he's finally, back to his version of 100%, and he also sort of talked about it as well, that during his time that he was sitting out with his meniscus injury, he was sort of watching the way that Naz Reid was stepping in, and the unselfishness with the team as a whole, and how he sort of reflected on that. And now he is in a position where he understands finally. I mean, I don't mean to be critical here, and I don't even think I am necessarily, but it seemed like with Towns for a while, there was still just his own version of ignorance where he wanted to get his, and he was sort of fixated on that. And now it seems like he is a lot more willing to be a part of a team system, and it doesn't matter how many points he scores individually. It's about winning the game. And it feels like that's finally clicked with him. And as much as some of the some of the foul stuff with Towns still drives me a little bit crazy, I think that we are sort of progressing to a point where we're getting the best version of Karl-Anthony Towns, which is massive for the Timberwolves, who are likely going to have to be taking on the Nuggets next round, and I think that's sneaky going to be a very good series. I feel like I say sneaky even though it's going to be a 2 versus 3 matchup, and I feel like the way that this has really built up over the way that these series have played out, I do think that more people are sort of on the Timberwolves than they were before. But if you haven't necessarily been fully plugged in to the Timberwolves during the regular season, and even myself, where I obviously was, I didn't think that they necessarily had a great chance against Denver, but it's at least, I'm picking Denver in a series between these two teams, but it at least makes you think a little bit more because of the level of defense they play individually. They have Rudy Gobert, who Jokic, on instances has still been able to take it to Gobert, but you can't. Nobody is going to fully eliminate Nikola Jokic, and I don't know. I think it should be a lot of fun. I think that they're definitely the biggest threat. I feel like you could even maybe make an argument about the Timberwolves being a bigger threat to Denver than the Celtics are. Again, just sort of throwing it out there. But in terms of the matchup in particular, I feel like the late game execution is definitely, and when Anthony Edwards is hitting everything that he wants to, like he was last night, that's obviously very hard to stop. From an offensive execution standpoint in crunch time situations, I do feel like there is just Denver's on a different atmosphere, a different plane than Minnesota is from that perspective. But again, just sort of throwing it out there. But on the Suns side of this, again, I don't want to bury them too much at this moment. We're going to, as the offseason moves on here, definitely get more into their options in particular. But this was a really, really disappointing series, of course, and you saw the videos of the Suns fans just sort of totally in disarray after these losses at home, and again, their team just not really feeling like they were connected, they were playing with urgency. It seemed like the Timberwolves had more energy despite being up 3-0, and they're a younger team that could get swept away in the excitement of being up early, but they were still hungry, and Phoenix just never really showed up to this one. So I talked up Beal a little bit for the defense that he was playing earlier in this series, but this was a really, really rough Beal game where he never had it going offensively, and things only seemingly got worse as the game went on. Late in, I believe it was the last 5 minutes, he had a couple bad turnovers. He missed a dunk. He ended up fouling out because he was playing Anthony Edwards almost at the half-court line and overplayed himself, so he ends up fouling out. Finished with 9 points, 2 assists, 1 rebound on 4 of 13 shooting. Beal's contract is only going to get more expensive as the years go on here as well, and it took them just about nothing to move off to end up trading for Beal, but there is a little bit of a situation. Again, you're playing retrospect. It's not like the options during this past trade deadline were really there necessarily, but they moved off of the Chris Paul contract, which could have been a potential trade piece in the future, but now they bring in Beal, who is just guaranteed for much longer, and again, his contract is only going up, where it's going to be $50 million next season, 53.6 in 25-26, and it's going to be $57 million in 2026-27. It's not like they have pieces necessarily to, make all these moves and attach draft capital to a Beal contract to move off of it, and because they don't control, I believe after this year's draft, they're not going to control their own draft pick until 2031, so they'll have some swaps in there, but they're going to have the least favorable of it, and it's a mess with Phoenix right now, and I'm not really sure what moves there are to build off of if you are Phoenix. So definitely, if anybody in the comment section has any ideas, I feel like it's going to probably, I don't know, they're probably going to run it back for another year. I'm not sure what they're going to be able to do, again, because of their lack of draft capital. Sometimes you can at least have guys down the pipeline that can sort of step up into bigger roles, like we've seen with Denver, with both Christian Brown and Peyton Watson. With the Celtics, you see it a little bit with Peyton Pritchard and Sam Hauser, but the Suns are very locked into the core that they have right now. And, some of these, pieces just sort of that they are surrounding themselves with, they just signed Grayson Allen to a new contract extension. I'm going to check right now what Nurkic's contract situation is in terms of his long-term security. But I actually thought, so he's under contract through the next 2 years. I feel like he's probably going to get moved somewhere along the line here. Now, I liked some of the minutes that Eric Gordon was actually able to give them from a 3-and-D perspective, and no, he wasn't necessarily on 100% offensively, but was playing very hard. He and Josh Okogie, I feel like, were the two guys that were actually, playing with the most desperation in these instances. Okogie, I've always had this weird thing for Okogie where I feel like he's a little bit of, he's reckless. Like we saw himself get into foul trouble and very limited playing time last night, but it didn't really seem like, Phoenix had any sort of energy until he came in. I believe he checked in for the first time in the second half, and that's when Phoenix started playing with a little bit more. But again, I just feel like this Suns team is in a lot of trouble. And you had quotes that came out about Kevin Durant never really felt comfortable with his role playing in Phoenix, and there's a whole Kevin Durant legacy conversation that I don't think we're going to be diving into today, but is definitely one that is going to surround him moving forward in his career, whether or not he wants to stay in Phoenix. I know that for his legacy look, it's definitely not a good thing to ask out yet again after all of these different situations, but I feel like partially for the Suns as well, that might be the best way to go because of the fact that, Ishbia took over as the owner and he wanted to play NBA 2K franchise mode where you just go and you get all these, talented players and it works out. That's just not how real life works. And I don't know, maybe things could be different if they could just find a ball handler somewhere along the way. They can find any sort of a trade partner for Brad Beal and try and restructure the financial situation. But it's a really bad situation right now in Phoenix. So if you have any thoughts on how to fix it, definitely let me know in the comments. This is something that I'm going to have to sort of get cooking on in terms of, putting together an idea for myself because I don't know what they do from here. But that is all we have time for on this segment. We're now going to be taking our final break of the show. And when we come back, we're going to be doing a little Boston sports segment. Don't do this very often, but it was a very big weekend for Boston sports. So stick with us and we will be right back.